There's something quiet I noticed while reading this book. Not shocking. Not dramatic. Just uncomfortable in a very honest way. I realized that most of what I believe about money didn't come from books, or classes, or logic. It came from watching people around me. From small moments. From fear. From stories I absorbed without questioning. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. Because money, despite what we like to think, is not really about numbers. It's about behavior. It's about how we react when things go wrong. And what we do when things go right. That's the quiet premise running through the psychology of money. And it's why this book stays with you long after you finish reading it. We often assume that if someone is good with money, they must be smart, educated, analytical. And if someone struggles financially, we assume the opposite. But the more I read, the clearer it became that this assumption is deeply flawed. Some of the smartest people in history made disastrous money decisions. And many people with very ordinary skills built extraordinary financial lives. Not because they knew something others didn't, but because they behaved differently. Morgan Housel doesn't try to teach you how to pick stocks, or time markets, or maximize returns. Instead, he asks a much more uncomfortable question. Why do people who know better still make bad money decisions? And the answer he keeps returning to is simple, but not easy to accept. We all experience money through the lens of our own lives. Our upbringing. Our insecurities. Our past wins and losses. What feels safe to you may feel reckless to someone else. What feels obvious to you may feel terrifying to another person. And that difference has very little to do with intelligence. This series is not about getting rich quickly. It's not about hacks or formulas. It's about understanding why money decisions are rarely rational, even when we think they are. And why controlling behavior often matters more than having information. In this first part, we'll begin where the book begins. With the idea that being good with money has almost nothing to do with how smart you are. We'll explore why people who appear successful can quietly collapse. Why others who seem average steadily build wealth. And why judging financial decisions without understanding someone's context almost always leads us to the wrong conclusions. As we move chapter by chapter, the goal isn't to memorize rules. It's to see money more clearly. To understand the invisible forces shaping every financial choice we make, often without realizing it. And by the end of this part, you may find yourself questioning not just how you handle money, but why you handle it the way you do. Let's begin with the first chapter. Chapter 1, No One's Crazy. One of the strongest ideas in this book appears right at the beginning, and it sounds almost too simple at first. No one is crazy when it comes to money. When I read that line, I paused. Because it directly challenges how we usually think about financial behavior. We look at someone else's decisions and instinctively judge them. Why would anyone take that much risk? Why would someone keep so much money in cash? Why would they sell too early, or hold for too long? From the outside, these choices often look irrational. But Housel makes a powerful point here. People make financial decisions based on the life they've lived, not the spreadsheet in front of them. And once you really absorb that idea, a lot of confusing behavior suddenly starts to make sense. Housel explains that each of us experiences the world of money through a very narrow window of personal history. Most of our views on risk, safety, and opportunity are shaped by events we happen to witness early in life. If you grew up during a time of economic stability, investing may feel normal, even boring. But if your early memories include recessions, job losses, or financial insecurity, then playing it safe doesn't feel conservative. It feels necessary. Neither person is wrong. They're simply responding to different realities. This is why two people can look at the same market, the same asset, the same opportunity, and come to completely opposite conclusions. Not because one understands money and the other doesn't, but because their emotional reference points are different. Housel writes that financial decisions are not made in spreadsheets. They are made at the dinner table, often with family, fear, pride, and memory sitting quietly in the background. That idea reframes everything. One of the examples in the book that stayed with me is how different generations approach investing. Someone who lived through the Great Depression learned a lesson that lasted a lifetime. Leverage can destroy you. Debt is dangerous. Cash equals safety. Decades later, someone who grew up during a long bull market learned a very different lesson. Risk is rewarded. Markets recover. Playing safe means missing out. Both groups are acting logically, based on what they personally experienced. And this is why financial advice often fails when it's delivered as one-size-fits-all wisdom. Because advice that ignores personal history isn't just incomplete, it's misleading. What feels reckless to one person feels prudent to another. What feels obvious to one feels terrifying to someone else. That doesn't make either of them crazy. There's a subtle but important shift that happens when you accept this idea. You stop asking, why would they do that? And instead, you ask, what did they experience that makes this decision feel reasonable to them? That shift matters, not just for how we judge others, but for how we judge ourselves. Many people feel guilt or shame around money. They believe their mistakes mean they're bad with finances, or undisciplined, or unintelligent. But Housel's point is gentler and more honest. Most so-called mistakes are simply people responding to the world as they understand it. Understanding this doesn't excuse bad decisions. But it does something more valuable: it creates clarity. Because once you realize that your financial instincts are shaped by your past, you gain the ability to question them. There's a quiet danger in assuming that smart people always make smart money decisions. History shows us the opposite. Some of the most financially educated individuals took risks that wiped them out. Not because they lacked information, but because confidence, ego, or past success distorted their sense of probability. At the same time, many people with no formal financial training quietly built wealth simply by avoiding extreme mistakes. They didn't try to be brilliant. They tried to be reasonable. This chapter isn't telling us to copy anyone else's strategy. It's reminding us that context matters more than credentials. And once you accept that, you're better prepared for what comes next. Because if no one is crazy, and if behavior is shaped by personal history, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How much of success is actually skill, and how much of it is luck? That's where the book goes next. And it's where our understanding of money becomes even more uncomfortable, and more honest. In the next chapter, we'll talk about luck and risk, and why copying successful people without understanding the role of chance can be one of the most dangerous financial mistakes we make. Chapter 2: Luck and Risk. After understanding that no one is crazy with money, the book quietly leads us into a more uncomfortable idea, one that challenges how we explain success and failure. Luck and risk are always present, but we rarely acknowledge them honestly. We prefer clean stories. Stories where success is earned purely through skill, discipline, or intelligence. And where failure is the result of laziness, ignorance, or poor choices. But reality is messier than that. Morgan Housel makes a simple yet unsettling point in this chapter. Luck and risk are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. To explain this, Housel asks us to think about people we admire for their success. We study their habits. We quote their decisions. We try to replicate their paths. But what we often ignore is the role of chance, the events that could never be predicted, planned, or repeated. The problem isn't that luck exists. The problem is that luck is invisible when we look backward. When someone succeeds, we highlight their smart decisions. When someone fails, we highlight their mistakes. But both outcomes may have been influenced by forces completely outside their control. This is where our understanding of money begins to break down. One of the most powerful stories in the book is about Ronald Read. Ronald Read was not a hedge fund manager. He didn't work on Wall Street. He was a gas station attendant and a janitor. When he died, people discovered something shocking. He had quietly accumulated over $8 million. There were no brilliant strategies behind his wealth. No complex financial models. Just patience, long-term investing, and time. Now contrast that with Richard Fuscone, another example Housel discusses. Fuscone was a Harvard-educated executive, deeply connected to the financial world. He understood money far better than most people ever will. And yet, after the financial crisis, he went bankrupt. This contrast isn't meant to shame intelligence or glorify simplicity. It's meant to show something more important. Knowledge does not eliminate risk. And success does not prove the absence of luck. Housel isn't arguing that skill doesn't matter. It does. But skill alone never tells the full story. Some people make smart decisions and fail anyway. Others make reckless decisions and succeed. And that's dangerous, because success that comes from luck often gets mistaken for skill. When that happens, people begin to take risks they don't fully understand. They assume past success means future certainty. They forget that the environment can change. This is how people get wiped out, not by one bad decision, but by overconfidence built on incomplete stories. Another idea that stood out to me in this chapter is survivorship bias. We tend to learn from the winners, the ones who made it through. But we rarely hear from those who made the same decisions and didn't survive the outcome. For every wildly successful investor we admire, there are countless others who followed similar strategies and disappeared quietly. Their stories don't get told. But they matter just as much. When we ignore them, we distort reality. We begin to believe that success is more predictable than it really is. And that belief pushes people toward unnecessary risk. There's a calm warning running through this chapter. The biggest financial tragedies don't come from being wrong once. They come from being right for the wrong reasons. Because being right due to luck teaches the wrong lesson. It encourages behavior that may work once, but not repeatedly. And money, unlike many other areas of life, punishes mistakes asymmetrically. You don't need to be right all the time to succeed. But one extreme mistake can undo decades of good decisions. That's why Housel emphasizes the importance of survival. Before returns, optimization, and even brilliance. Just staying in the game. This chapter subtly shifts how we should think about financial success. Instead of asking, how can I maximize my gains? The better question becomes, how can I avoid being wiped out? Because compounding only works if you're still standing. And understanding the role of luck and risk doesn't make you pessimistic. It makes you realistic. It encourages humility. It builds margin for error. And it reminds you that no one, no matter how smart, is immune to uncertainty. As this chapter comes to an end, a deeper tension begins to surface. If luck and risk play such a huge role, If survival matters more than brilliance, then why do so many people who already have enough continue to take dangerous risks? Why do they keep pushing, often until everything collapses? That question leads directly into the next chapter. In Chapter 3, Never Enough, we'll explore why knowing when to stop may be one of the most important, and hardest, financial skills of all. Chapter 3, Never Enough. After understanding luck, risk, and the importance of survival, the book moves into a far more personal, and unsettling, question. How much is enough? Because if luck can make you successful, and risk can wipe you out, then knowing when to stop should be one of the most valuable skills in finance. And yet, it's one of the rarest. Morgan Housel calls this chapter, Never Enough, and it explores a truth that feels uncomfortable precisely because it's so common. Many financial disasters don't happen because people have too little. They happen because people with a lot still want more. Housel begins this chapter with a powerful story about Rajaratnam and Rajat Gupta, individuals who had extraordinary careers, wealth, and status. They were already successful beyond what most people could imagine. And yet, they crossed lines they didn't need to cross. Not because they were desperate. Not because they lacked opportunity. But because enough was never clearly defined. This is an important distinction. Greed isn't always loud or obvious. Often, it's subtle. It hides behind ambition, comparison, and the quiet fear of falling behind. The core idea of this chapter is simple but hard to live by. There is no reason to risk what you already have and need for what you don't have and don't need. When I read that, it felt less like financial advice and more like a life rule. Because once you cross the line of enough, the game changes. You're no longer playing to survive or grow. You're playing to win, without a clear definition of what winning even means. And that's where danger enters. One of the reasons enough is so hard to recognize is comparison. We rarely measure our success in isolation. We measure it relative to others. Someone will always have more. More money, more influence, and more visibility. And in a world where those comparisons are constantly visible, the finish line keeps moving. Housel points out that this is why wealth accumulation often has no natural stopping point. Without a personal definition of enough, ambition turns into an endless chase. And endless chases encourage unnecessary risk. This chapter also ties back to the earlier discussion of luck and risk. People who succeed due to luck often believe the success is entirely earned. That belief creates confidence. Confidence creates boldness. And boldness, unchecked, invites ruin. Not because taking risks is wrong, but because taking risks after you've already won is often unnecessary. There's a quiet wisdom in knowing when to stop pressing forward. Another important idea Housel introduces here is the asymmetry of failure. You can be smart, disciplined, and careful for years. But one moment of excess, one decision driven by ego or comparison, can undo everything. This is why so many financial collapses happen at the top, not the bottom. It's not the absence of opportunity that destroys people. It's the inability to say, "This is enough." What makes this chapter especially powerful is that it doesn't frame enough as a number. It's not a specific income, or net worth, or milestone. Enough is a mindset. It's the ability to prioritize what matters more than what impresses. And that idea subtly reshapes how we think about money. Because money, at its core, is a tool. And tools are meant to serve life, not consume it. As this chapter comes to a close, the book begins shifting from the dangers of excess toward a more constructive idea. If knowing when to stop protects you from ruin, Then what exactly does money give you when it's used wisely? What is the real reward for being patient, disciplined, and reasonable over time? That's the question at the heart of the next chapter. In Chapter 4, Confounding Compounding, we'll explore how small, consistent decisions, left alone long enough, can quietly create extraordinary outcomes. Chapter 4, Confounding Compounding. After exploring excess and the danger of never knowing when to stop, the book shifts its tone again, this time towards something quieter, slower, and far more powerful. Compounding. Not as a formula. Not as a calculation. But as a force that most people deeply underestimate. Morgan Housel calls this chapter, Confounding Compounding, and the word confounding is important here. Because compounding doesn't impress us in the short term. It doesn't look dramatic. And that's why it's so easy to ignore. Housel begins with the story of Warren Buffett, a name everyone associates with investing genius. But instead of focusing on Buffett's intelligence, Housel highlights something far more revealing. The majority of Buffett's wealth came after his mid-60s. Not because he suddenly became smarter. Not because he changed strategies. But because he stayed invested for an extraordinarily long time. This reframes how we usually think about success. Buffett's advantage wasn't brilliance alone. It was time. And time, when combined with consistency, does something almost invisible at first, but unstoppable in the long run. The uncomfortable truth is that compounding doesn't reward intensity. It rewards endurance. Most people want results that feel proportional to effort. Work hard now, see big gains soon. But compounding works differently. It grows slowly, quietly, and unevenly. For long periods, it feels like nothing is happening. And then, almost suddenly, everything changes. That delay is what makes compounding so hard to respect. Housel makes an important point here. Good investing isn't necessarily about earning the highest returns. It's about earning reasonable returns for the longest period of time. That distinction matters. Because chasing high returns often requires taking risks that shorten your time horizon. And once your time is cut short, compounding never gets the chance to work. This brings us back to survival. Compounding is fragile. It only works if you stay in the game. Another subtle idea in this chapter is that small decisions matter far more than dramatic ones. We tend to overvalue big moves, perfect timing, bold bets, brilliant insights. But compounding thrives on repetition, not perfection. Doing something reasonable, again and again, without interruption. This is why avoiding catastrophic mistakes often matters more than making exceptional decisions. Because one major failure doesn't just cause a loss, it breaks the chain. And compounding depends entirely on that chain remaining unbroken. There's a humility embedded in this chapter. It reminds us that success doesn't require extraordinary behavior. It requires consistency, patience, and the willingness to let time do its work. This idea feels almost boring. And that's exactly why it's so powerful. Most people abandon compounding because it doesn't provide immediate feedback. They underestimate how dramatically slow growth can become explosive when given enough time. As this chapter closes, the book subtly shifts our attention again. If compounding rewards patience, if survival protects it, and if excess destroys it, then the real challenge isn't understanding the math. It's managing ourselves, our expectations, our emotions, our need for quick results. That realization leads directly into the next chapter. In Chapter 5, Getting Wealthy versus Staying Wealthy, We'll explore why building money and keeping money require completely different skills, and why most people fail at the second one, not the first. Chapter 5: Getting Wealthy versus Staying Wealthy. Up to this point, the book has slowly dismantled some of our most common assumptions about money. That intelligence guarantees success. That luck can be ignored. That growth is always good. That compounding rewards brilliance. In Chapter 5, Morgan Housel introduces a distinction that quietly ties all of these ideas together. Getting wealthy and staying wealthy are two entirely different skills. Most people never separate the two. And because of that, they confuse progress with permanence. Housel begins by acknowledging something important. Getting wealthy often requires optimism and risk. Starting a business. Investing aggressively. Taking chances when outcomes are uncertain. Many fortunes are built because someone was willing to act when others hesitated. Luck often plays a role, but without boldness, opportunity passes unnoticed. This is why stories of wealth creation are usually exciting. They involve momentum, confidence, and decisive action. But here's where the mistake happens. People assume the same behavior that helped them build wealth will help them keep it. And that assumption is often what destroys them. Staying wealthy, Housel explains, is a defensive game. It's not about intelligence. It's not about spotting the next opportunity. It's about avoiding ruin. This idea may sound unambitious, even pessimistic. But history repeatedly proves it true. You can do many things right and still lose everything if you expose yourself to a single catastrophic risk. And money is unforgiving in that way. Once wealth is lost, it often takes far more effort, and luck, to rebuild it. Housel connects this idea directly to earlier chapters. Luck and risk don't disappear after success. They often increase. When someone becomes wealthy, they gain access to bigger opportunities, but also bigger dangers. Larger bets. More leverage. Greater exposure to forces they cannot control. The margin for error shrinks. And this is where behavior becomes more important than knowledge. One of the most important ideas in this chapter is the role of paranoia, not fear, but awareness. Staying wealthy requires an understanding that the world is unpredictable. That markets change. That systems fail. That no streak lasts forever. This doesn't mean withdrawing from life or opportunity. It means building a buffer. Room for error. The ability to survive mistakes. Housel argues that people who stay wealthy often do one unremarkable thing exceptionally well. They plan for things to go wrong. This brings us back to compounding. Compounding is powerful, but fragile. It only works if it's uninterrupted. One extreme mistake can reset decades of steady progress. That's why staying wealthy is less about maximizing returns and more about minimizing regrets. Less about reaching the peak and more about staying on the mountain. And that requires a mindset shift. Another subtle but important idea in this chapter is the difference between growth and endurance. Growth feels productive. Endurance feels boring. But endurance is what allows growth to compound. People who chase excitement often mistake motion for progress. They believe constant action is necessary to justify success. But wealth doesn't demand constant action. It demands consistency and restraint. Sometimes, the most powerful decision is doing nothing. Housel also emphasizes humility. Success can distort perception. It convinces people that past wins were the result of skill alone. This belief is dangerous. Because when success is attributed entirely to intelligence, people feel justified in taking larger and larger risks. They underestimate randomness. They overestimate control. Staying wealthy requires remembering that the same forces that helped you rise can pull you down. And that memory must stay active, not theoretical. This chapter quietly reframes what financial success actually means. It's not about reaching a number. It's about maintaining independence, stability, control over your future. In that sense, staying wealthy is not about ambition, it's about preservation of freedom. And freedom, as the book repeatedly suggests, is the true dividend of money. As this chapter closes, a larger picture begins to form. We've seen that behavior matters more than intelligence. Luck and risk are always present. Excess destroys stability. Compounding rewards patience. Survival protects everything else. What remains now is to connect these ideas to how people actually live with money over time. How expectations shape decisions. How uncertainty influences behavior. And how reasonable thinking often beats rational optimization. That's where the next part of the book takes us. In the next chapter, we'll move deeper into how time, uncertainty, and long-term thinking shape financial outcomes. And why reasonable decisions often outperform rational ones in the real world. As this first part comes to an end, it's worth pausing, not to summarize, but to reflect. Because what we've explored here isn't a system or a strategy. It's a way of seeing. We began with a simple idea, that no one is crazy when it comes to money. That our financial decisions are shaped by the lives we've lived, not just the information we have. From there, we saw how luck and risk quietly influence outcomes, often far more than skill. How success can mislead us when we mistake chance for competence. And how survival, not brilliance, is what allows progress to compound over time. We confronted the danger of never enough. The subtle pull of comparison. The way excess tempts people to risk what they already have for what they don't need. And finally, we arrived at a distinction that ties everything together. That building wealth and keeping wealth are not the same challenge. Throughout these chapters, one theme keeps returning. Almost quietly. Money is not a math problem. It's a behavior problem. It reflects our patience. Our humility. Our ability to control ourselves when outcomes are uncertain. And perhaps the most important insight of all is this. You don't need to be exceptional to do well with money. You need to be reasonable. Reasonable people survive. And survival is what gives time the chance to work. That's the quiet foundation this book is built on. In part 2, we'll move beyond these foundations and explore what they mean in practice. We'll look at why long-term thinking often feels uncomfortable, but works. Why planning for uncertainty matters more than predicting the future. And why the goal of money isn't accumulation, but control over how you live your life. If part 1 was about understanding the forces shaping financial behavior, part 2 is about learning how to live with those forces, calmly, patiently, and intentionally. We'll continue from the next chapter, where the book begins to challenge one of our strongest instincts. The need for certainty in an uncertain world. That's where we'll pick up next.